welcome to One Life Church. So glad that you chose to spend part of your day with us. We'll be having guest speaker Eric Hernandez with us today, and he'll be talking all about how to defend your faith. So we are excited for that. Hey, if you're new here, we would love to get connected with you. You can go to onelifechurch.info and hit I'm new here. Now, basically what onelifechurch.info is it's your one-stop shop for everything here at One Life. So if you have questions about an event that's coming up, if you need someone to pray for you, if you're interested in joining a group or a team, the only place you have to remember is onelifechurch.info. And when we're talking about that, I see some similarities in something that I'm doing myself right now. So right now, I'm trying to learn how to play the keyboard. Now, this is like day 6, so I don't expect myself to be amazing. But a good and bad part about learning it is that I love YouTube. Now, if you're learning keyboard, YouTube is a great place that has a lot of helpful information. But I'm also realizing that those YouTube videos are good, but just watching them can only get me so far. And what's really going to help me grow is actually sitting down and practicing. And in the same way, when you come to church and consume the content, that's great. Content can help you in a lot of different ways, and we love that you want to do that. But sometimes I think we get in this habit of only consuming the content. Now, whether it's online or actually coming in person, we consume that content and we're like, oh, okay, that was helpful. But then we just move on. And maybe for you, that's how your church experience has felt. Maybe you've been consuming content for a long time. And that's good that you are consuming the content. I'm hoping you're getting a lot out of it. But I also think there's another side to it. And when you think about it like you're trying to learn to play the keyboard, you wouldn't just watch those YouTube videos and then move on. You would actually apply what you're learning. And that's one of the reasons that we have groups and teams and different ways that you can volunteer in the city. Because each of those are ways that you can be in community with other people and actually live out the stuff that we're learning in the content. So if you want to take that next step to be a part of a team or a group, or to join us in generosity, or to sign up for a Saturday serve day, we want to help you do that. You can go to onelifechurch.info and you can see how you can take the next step and get the most out of your church experience. All right, again, guys, thank you so much for joining us. And now we'll start with the time of worship through music right now.
Good morning. I want to welcome you guys to One Life. We're so excited that you're here with us. This is the time we get to get to our feet and to worship our God full on with all that we have. If you're watching from home, we're glad that you're watching too. Just join us in this time of worship and give God all the glory that He deserves. You guys ready this morning? Come on, let's get your feet. Let's do it. but to bow. Chains have no choice but to break. Shame has no choice but to leave in your presence. Come on. Fear has no choice but to bow. Chains have no choice but to break. Shame has no choice but to leave in your presence. Fear has no choice but to bow. Chains have no choice but to break. Shame has no choice but to leave in your presence. So let the Spirit rise up, break through the walls, beat on the doors, crash through the window, cover the earth, the earth, the earth. Let the Spirit rise up, break through the walls, beat on the doors, crash through the window, cover the earth, the earth, the earth.
Fear has no choice but to bow. Chains have no choice but to break. Shame has no choice but to leave in your presence. Fear has no choice but to bow. Chains have no choice but to break. Shame has no choice but to leave in your presence. Fear has no choice but to bow. Chains have no choice but to break. Shame has no choice but to leave in your presence. Fear has no choice but to bow. Chains have no choice but to break. Shame has no choice but to leave in your presence. So let the Spirit rise up, break through the walls, beat on the doors, crash through the window, cover the earth, the earth, the earth. Let the Spirit rise up, break through the walls, beat on the doors, crash through the window, cover the earth, the earth,
Just keep that up. This time of extravagant worship. So God is worthy. Every song that we could sing, every breath that we could breathe. So let's give him his praise this morning. Come on. Worthy of every song we could ever sing. Worthy of all the praise we could ever bring. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you, Jesus.
Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save. Worthy of every breath we could ever breathe. We live for you.
You are holy, there is no one like you, there is none beside you. Open up my eyes and wonder and show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me in your love to those around me.
Jesus, the name above every other name. Jesus, the only one who could ever save.
will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. I will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Come on. Will build my life upon your love. It is a firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Holy, there is no one like you. There is no beside you. Open up my eyes and wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me. Give it up to those around me. Holy, there is no one like you. There is no beside you. Open up my eyes and wonder. Show me who you are and fill me with your heart and lead me. Give it up to those around. And I will build my life upon your love. It is my firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. I will build my life upon your love. It is my firm foundation. I will put my trust in you alone, and I will not be shaken. Standing on a firm foundation, we will never be shaken. Standing on a firm foundation, you alone. And I will build my life upon your love. Father God, thank you for this time that you've given us just to make your name known. You're worthy. You're worthy. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to just to worship you. Pray that you would work in our hearts. Build your spirit up in this place so it overflows into our communities, Lord. So your love spreads across the earth. Thank you for using us for that. Help us to open our heart to wherever it is that you lead. For it is in Jesus' name that we pray, Lord. Amen. You may be seated.
Hey, thanks for spending that time of worship with us. Now we're going to continue talking about worship. We talk about generosity. So we are starting to work on something that I think a lot of you are going to be excited about. Now, if you've been around One Life for quite a while, you might have heard about an event called Because. Now, if you aren't familiar with Because, like I wasn't personally because I haven't been around here for a long time, Basically what it is, it's a series where we talk all about worship. So this is going to be a 50-day long series where we'll be taking you on a journey where you'll really grow in your worship and grow closer to God. And this series is going to be leading up to our Big Because event, where we'll all be coming together at our East Campus on September 24th and 25th. Now, I can assure you this is not going to be your average worship service, so you are not going to want to miss it. And the event itself is a way that, after we've learned the content side of it, to really live out our worship to God. Now, in this series, we're going to be talking about a lot of different kinds of worship. Because sometimes when we think about worship, the first thing that comes to my mind, at least, is singing songs in church on a Sunday. Like, that feels like worship. And while that's a big part of worshiping God, there's so much more to worship. It's about how you live. It's about how you treat people. It's about how you use your money. And that's one of the reasons why we do these generosity spots each week. Because giving of our finances to God is an act of worship. And I remember in our giving series when the idea of generosity being worship really came to life for me personally. Because we all had these blue commitment cards that represented what we were going to commit above our normal giving. And at first, I thought it was just going to be a small thing. But as the series went on, I really learned how much our trust is tied to our finances. And just a reminder, because sometimes I don't think we celebrate it enough, I want to say thank you, not just for filling out one of those cards, but also for being consistent. Because it's one thing to fill out a card, but we've already seen so many of you actually go through with it, where the rubber meets the road, and really trust God with your finances. And hey, if you want to join us in generosity, you can go to onelifechurch.info and hit give. Or if you're at a campus, we also have places for you to give there as well. All right, again, thank you so much for spending your day with us. And now we'll hear from our lead pastor, Brett Nicholson.
Hey, welcome everybody over in Henderson, and those of you at our West Campus, those of you join us online, and our East Campus as well. So some of you may remember last year, for about a 6-month run, every month, we would do a thing called One Life Explorer Edition. And what we said, One Life Explorer Edition was a day when we bend and direct the service towards people who do not believe, and so we can make the case for the faith in our church. And we did it for a 6-month run, and then we said, hey, we're going to evaluate those. And so you guys were given the chance to evaluate them. We got a lot of positive comments. We got several negative comments, and that's okay. That's why we asked for critique. One of the things that people asked for is that we would have people who were coming in from the outside and represent more diversity and everything else that way. And so today was actually scheduled to be a One Life Explorer Edition, but what we decided to do with our guest speaker was he speaks to unbelievers. He's done a number of debates on college campuses and interacts in that world, but he talks to Christian people about the importance of being able to represent your faith well inside the culture. And so we thought, you know what we need to do is talk up that value first before we go on and go back to doing One Life Explorer editions at some point. So this morning we have a gentleman by the name of Eric Hernandez, and Eric Hernandez is a number of things. I need to read the card because I always get this wrong. He's out of the Texas General Baptist Convention, and we have another Texan in here, so you take that for what it is. He is, among other things, a therapist. He's an apologist. He is a millennial specialist with the convention there, and I found out most importantly, he was a drummer in a metal band. Okay, so that may be part of his resume there that I think is very important. But I want to ask you guys to give a very, very rousing and excited, enthusiastic One Life welcome to Eric Hernandez. Here he is. All right.
Amen. It's good to be with you guys this morning. Thank you for that applause because you probably have no idea who I am, but I appreciate that very much. For the sake of time, I want to jump in. If you want to know more about me, you can go on YouTube. Just don't read the comment section around the kids. You know how that can be. But again, thank you, Pastor. Thank you for having me. And I really want to get into this because of how important this is in our society and culture. Consider this. Anybody know who this gentleman here is? Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion, and in it he says, one of his famous quotes is, that the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. He is jealous and proud of it. He is a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capricious, malevolent bully. What do you think? How does that make you feel? Because suffice it to say that he just finished saying a lot of nasty things about the God that you and I worship. But more importantly, how would you respond to someone like this? Well, there's a lot to say. We're not going to have time to go into it, but I'd recommend a good book by Paul Copan, Is God a Moral Monster?, where he addresses a lot of Dawkins' claims. But I'm reminded of something that Christ said in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. He said that you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its purpose, its function, it is no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and walked on by people. Now, to understand the point that Christ is trying to make, you have to first understand the context of salt. Because, see, in ancient times, they didn't have refrigerators, and because there's such a wide technological gap between the time this was written to now, we tend to miss these illustrations and the point that is being made by them. So in ancient times, because there were no refrigerators, if they wanted to preserve meat, what they would do is they would add salt to meat, and salt would add as a preservative to keep meat from perishing. Now, with this in mind, who is the salt of the earth? Us, you, me, the church. So, keeping with the analogy, what would the meat represent? The world, the culture, society. And I ask you this, is the meat going bad? Absolutely. Turn on the news, look at any social media outlet, the meat is clearly spoiling and going bad. But here's what Christ is saying. Suppose you live in these times and you go to the local market, you buy a bag of salt, you bring it home, and you begin to add the salt to various pieces of meat. But you notice that no matter how much salt you add, no matter what type of meat it is, the meat continues to perish and spoil and rotten and go bad just as it normally would, even if there were no salt to begin with. So the point Christ is saying is that if this continues to happen, then at some point you're going to have to step back and stop asking what's wrong with the meat. And at some point you have to step back and objectively ask yourself, what is wrong with the salt? I have two questions for you. First question, I like to ask these two questions. Why are you a Christian, and why should someone else be a Christian? Now, when someone asks me, what is apologetics? I can give the verses, and we'll go through a few, but the best way to explain this is I say, let me ask you these two questions, and let me respond as a skeptic. Because if you notice, the answer to the first question may not necessarily apply to the second. For example, I was once speaking at a men's conference, and backstage I was sitting with some of the other pastors who were going to be speaking. And one gentleman, he approached me in a kind of patronizing way, kind of says, oh, so you do apologetics, kind of like, that's cute. And he says, but you know what they say, a man with an experience is never at the mercy of a man with an argument. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, I have my testimony, answering the first question, of what God did in my life, and no one can argue with my experience or my testimony because, see, I was in gangs, I was violent, I was in drugs, I was an alcoholic, I was going through a divorce, but the one true God saved my life, and no one can argue with that. I said, okay. I said, out of curiosity, do you ever do any evangelism? He said, oh, yeah. We go to these apartment complexes by our church about once a month, and we set up this station, and we cook hot dogs and hamburgers, and we interact with the community, we play basketball with the kids, and then I stand up and share my testimony. I said, it's fantastic. But let me ask you a question. As a hypothetical, suppose a different religious group came to the same apartment complex. You go for lunch, let's say they come for dinner, and let's say they're Muslim. And they go to the same location you did, and they set up the station, and they cook hot dogs and hamburgers, and they interact with the community, and they play basketball with the kids. But suppose their religious leader, who's a Muslim, stands up, grabs a mic, and for the sake of argument, let's pretend his testimony is like, I don't know, 10 times better than your testimony. Let's suppose he was going through 10 divorces, because, he's Muslim and they're polygamous. And let's suppose he was in 10 different gangs, doing 10 different types of drugs, with 10 bottles of alcohol. But then he stands up, he grabs a mic and leans in and says, but the one true God, Allah, changed my life. Now, earlier you told me that the man with an experience is never at the mercy with a man with an argument. So based on his testimony, would you then drop to your knees and devote your life and become a Muslim? And he said, no, of course not. And I said, right. That's kind of my point. Now, don't hear me saying what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that testimonies have no place. I'm saying that Scripture tells us that the preaching of the cross is foolishness to those who don't believe, but it is power to those who do believe. So our job as believers is, how do we take what the world deems as foolishness and translate that to demonstrate its power? I submit to you that is in part the discipline and task of apologetics. Now, if you were to ask me, Eric, how would you answer these two questions? Why am I a Christian, and why should someone else be a Christian? I have one answer for both. And it's really deep and profound. You might want to write this down. Here's my answer. No one took out a pen on that part. Here's my answer. Because it's true. What a novel thought, right? In other words, imagine this. Suppose you said, Eric, why do you believe water is H2O? And I said, well, let me tell you why. See, once a week I get with my friends, and we read books about how water is H2O. And ever since I began to believe water is H2O, I've become a much better husband and a much better father to my children. It's made me a much better person. And then we get together once a week, and we sing these beautiful songs about how water is H2O, and then tears roll down my face, and it's such a great experience. And recently, the secular rapper came out, and he now believes that water is H2O, so it must be, and just made my life so much better. Now, if you laugh at that, how different is that when you ask someone, why are you a Christian? Because you are the salt of the earth. 1 Peter 3:15 says, be ready to give an answer, or some translations say defense, to anyone who asks you to account for the hope that is in you. Now, if you look at that word answer, actually in the Greek it's the word apologia, which means defense, and hence apologetics is simply giving a defense for what we believe and why we believe it. Because if you're taking notes, I want you to write down this. See, in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, 4 and 5, it gives us a context for spiritual warfare. And what it tells us is that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty for God for the overthrow and destruction and pulling down of strongholds. So then the question becomes, what's a stronghold? Because if spiritual warfare encompasses to tear down a stronghold, we have to know what a stronghold is. And the next verse actually defines it. And it says, inasmuch as we refute arguments, reasonings, and every proud and high thing that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. So biblically speaking, a stronghold is defined as thoughts, ideas, reasonings, philosophies, arguments, presuppositions, anything that goes against the knowledge of God. And this is quite literally, according to Scripture, the spiritual warfare within our culture. Because we live in a culture where people have these strongholds that they're struggling with, whether they realize it or not, that are going to hinder them from coming to the knowledge of God. And thus a person cannot come to the knowledge or a deeper knowledge of God when they have such strongholds. Which means that biblically speaking, if you, first of all, this is a command to New Testament believers. So if you are a New Testament believer, we have already seen the Bible command you to be ready to give an answer, and that when you encounter strongholds within your culture, you are commanded by God to tear, destroy, demolish these strongholds. So biblically speaking, if you want to be effective in evangelism, if you want to be effective in spiritual warfare, if you want to be effective in discipleship, you cannot do it without apologetics, biblically speaking. And if you take issue with that, you can take it up with the author. I just read the book, I didn't write it. Tough crowd this morning. So, some people at this point, sometimes they do get pushback, and people say, well, Eric, but isn't it just all about faith? I don't have time to go into how this word has been misapplied and abused by both Christians and non-believers, but let's look at something that Christ said. Mark 12:30, the Pharisees approach him, and they say, look, Jesus, out of all the commandments in the Old Testament, which one is the greatest? How many commandments are in the Old Testament, by the way? Some people usually shout out 10, and I say close enough, 613, but 10, it's pretty close. But out of all 613 commandments, Jesus says this one is the greatest. He said is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Now, if we can assess this briefly, look at the modern day church, and I would say the 21st century modern American church, I think we do a fair job of loving God with our heart. That is indicative of our emotions. We get emotional at the altar. We lift our hands, and that is good. That is part of the greatest commandment. Continue to do that. And then there's loving God with your strength, which would be indicative of your service towards God. And I've seen this church do a wonderful job, quite frankly, of that. Volunteering, helping out, pulling out chairs, getting things together, and that's great. Continue to do that. But then there's loving God with the mind. And if you were to look up this word mind in the Greek, it implies the notion of your intellect and your faculty of understanding. And if I can say with a heavy heart, quite frankly, this is where the modern day church has dropped the ball. And it hasn't always been this way. Because if you were to go back in time with me to 300 AD, 325 to be exact, you would see the church fathers gathered at the Council of Nicaea, and they are beginning to address these heresies that are arising about the doctrine of Christ and the incarnation and the Trinity, and they began to hammer out the best way to articulate this, because you have to understand, Christianity was still a relatively new religion at the time. And so they began to ask questions like, well, how can we explain this? Well, we can explain that there is one what but three whos. One God, three persons. Well, what does it mean to be a person? What is persona? Well, what about Jesus? He had a divine nature, but we can explain that he took on a human nature, so he had a dual nature. Well, okay, but now what are the metaphysical implications or necessary conditions for what it takes to have a nature? Who here has ever asked or answered those questions that you know of? But mind you, around all this time, the point is that their greatest concern was that, is what we believe, is it true? Is it biblical? Is it logically consistent? Is it philosophically coherent? But mind you, at this time was a time that the church had seen some of the greatest persecution in history. They were being fed to lions for entertainment. They were being whipped, crucified upside down, boiled alive, stoned to death, beheaded, and yet their greatest concern is what we believe true. Now fast forward with me to the present time and look at the modern day church and ask ourselves, what is our greatest concern? Are the church pews comfortable enough? Is there enough coffee in the lobby for the visitors? Is there enough pizza for the youth? All fair questions, but what is our greatest concern? Are we loving God with the mind? I was once invited a few years ago to speak for this youth group, and prior to the service, the pastor wanted to have lunch with me. And as we were talking, he said, I know you do apologetics, but I just don't think it has a place behind the pulpit. Maybe Bible study, but certainly not Sunday morning service. And I didn't want to argue with him. I'm about to preach at his church, and thankfully my sermon wasn't on apologetics, but I just said, well, agree to disagree. So as the youth pastor invites me up that evening, he says, just take a few minutes and introduce yourself, tell people what you do. So I briefly mention apologetics, but I say, you know what, but if you have questions about that, see me after the service, we can talk. As I concluded and I walked to my seat, I began to gather my things, and out of the corner of my eye, I see this young man and his mom, and they're just like rushing towards me, and they like come right towards me, and they stand right in front of me, and the young man looks at me and says, tell her you said we could ask you questions, right? And I thought, did I say something wrong? Is everything, I was a little concerned, and I said, yeah, is everything okay? And then his mom looked at me and said, as long as you're okay with this, I'll let y'all talk, and she walked off. And I asked him, I said, what was that about? And then what he said next broke my heart. He said, well, I'm an atheist. I don't want to come to church, but my mom forces me to come, so I come. But I had questions. And as I began to ask these questions to those in my youth group, they couldn't answer them, so they sent me to the youth pastor, and he couldn't answer them. And it's gotten to the point to where the pastor and the youth pastor have sat me down, and they said, look, if you're going to come to church, that's fine, but sit down, shut up, and stop bothering people with your questions. And then he looked at me and said, but you don't come here, so you're an exception. And you said we could ask you questions. So if you don't mind, can I ask you questions? We talked for at least an hour. Great questions, great conversation. And I said, who have you been reading? He's a junior in high school, and of course, Dawkins, Hitchens, some of the other atheists. And I said, look, I have to go, but I'm going to see your pastor tomorrow for breakfast. If you'd like, and if he would allow it, we can continue the conversation over the phone. And he said, that would be so great. I would really appreciate that. I have breakfast with the pastor the next morning, and as we're talking, I said, you know, Pastor, you said yesterday you don't think apologetics has a place behind the pulpit, but you do realize you have an atheist in your youth group, right? And he looked down at his napkin kind of nervously and laughed and said, yeah, that's so-and-so. We're praying for him. And I said, you know, it's going to take more than that. He's a junior in high school. It's a small town in Texas, one high school. I said, if you lose this kid, he's going to take about half that youth group with him. Out of respect for you, I didn't want to give him my card, but here's my card with my email and my personal cell. If you're okay with it, would you give it to him so we can continue the conversation? That was almost 10 years ago. I doubt he ever got it. But you are the salt of the earth. There are 3 dominant strongholds in our culture that I want to briefly go through. There's a lot to unpack. I'll go through these quickly, though. And fair warning, I have ADHD and I'm Hispanic, so I naturally talk fast. But at the end of this, I'll give you a link where you can download my slides. Thank you for laughing at my mental disorder. And you'll be able to just download that from there. So let's go through some examples. 3 dominant strongholds. The first is known as relativism or postmodernism. And in a nutshell, it is a view that there is no truth. Truth is relative. There is no right or wrong. There is no absolute truth. So for example, if here's a podium and I say there's a dog to the right of the podium, and my brother in the front row says, no, there's a dog to the left of the podium, who's right and who's wrong? Well, we're both right. And in the same way, says a postmodernist, there is no objective point of view or truth. It just depends on who you're asking, and it's relative to their position. And so, says the postmodernist, look, if you're against same-sex marriage, that's fine, but don't tell someone else they can't marry who they love. That's your truth. And if you're against abortion, fine, but don't tell this young lady who got raped she can't have an abortion, and don't force your religious morality onto someone because there is no absolute truth. Stronghold. And then you have what's known as scientism, note the ism, and it is a view that science is the only way, or perhaps the best way, to gain knowledge about science, about reality. And a person may say, if it cannot be proven scientifically, then either it cannot be known or it cannot be true. So if you want me to believe in God or the afterlife, show me a scientist that has gone into heaven with the lab equipment, come back and given us empirical evidence about this afterlife you talk of. But if you cannot give me this scientific evidence, then either it's not true or it cannot be true, and why should I believe it? Stronghold. The last one is known as naturalism. It is a view that the physical world is all that exists, nothing more, nothing less. And this one really hits home for me. Freshman year of college, I decided to take my first philosophy class. I later found my professor was an atheist, but I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to take another class in philosophy. And everyone warned me, all of my peers said, look, if you're going to take another class, whatever you do, do not take Professor Pena's class. If you take this professor's class, he's also an atheist, but he's antagonistic. He's going to try to make you lose your faith. Don't take his class. And my response was, when does it start and where can I sign up? not because I wanted to lose my faith, but because I too had genuine questions. I too had been hurt by the church to say stop asking questions. So I wanted to ask questions and I wanted to learn. And I figured if Christianity is true, I need to know why. But if it's false, I still need to know why. And perhaps this is the man for the job. So the pivotal moments in my life and ministry was one class in particular where he walks in and he holds up this antidepressant pill. And he says, now, religion wants us to believe in something like a soul. And because of the soul, we can have hope in an afterlife and seeing our family and friends that have gone before us. But here's the problem. See, according to Christianity, your thoughts and beliefs and emotions and sensations are in your soul, which are also supposed to be immaterial. But if my soul is immaterial and my emotions are immaterial, then how is it that this tiny pill, which is physical, how can something tiny and material affect or change the immaterial? Because every time we look at brain scans, all we see are neurons firing. And every time we look at the body under a microscope, all we find are the base elements of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But we've never found anything like a soul. How do we explain that? And he says, I'll tell you how. The answer is simple. See, the answer is that there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there is no afterlife. You are just a physical brain and body, a meat machine, and we need to live with this fact, get on with our lives, and stop believing in these foolish fairy tales. Class dismissed. Stronghold. How would you respond? Because this troubled me deeply. Because for the first time in my life, I heard an argument that, if true, would actually prove Christianity is false. How so? Paul in 1 Corinthians says that if there is no resurrection of the dead, he's essentially saying, I'm paraphrasing, Christianity is false. No resurrection, no Christianity, it cannot be true. But by the same token, you see, if there is no soul, well, then there could be no resurrection, and thus Christianity would be false. Stronghold. How would you respond to something like this? Well, guys, we're out of time. If you want the answer, you can get my DVD back there, A Case for the Soul, for only $20. It's a great one. I've heard it myself. No, but in all seriousness, I do briefly want to mention this. Before we go into some responses, let's go through a little bit about what I brought. I did bring A Case for the Soul. It's an hour. This has now become my area of specialization, if you will, that I've really focused on. The most expensive thing we have back there is the apologetics course. It's about 10 hours. Comes with about 200 pages of notes. It's like a crash course in apologetics. What we're talking about today is the spiritual warfare of our culture. And we're going to touch a little bit about evidence of God. And for the price of these that I just mentioned, I've got a lot more. I've got some debates. I have a debate on the soul, a debate I did on abortion, a 3-hour debate I did on an atheist radio show. And I brought all that with me. So people usually ask, well, do you have a deal for everything? And what I usually say is, if you want to take everything on the table, which is 20-something hours of material, if you'd like to make a donation of about $100, you can take all that. And the professor I just mentioned, has anyone seen the movie God's Not Dead? Yeah, I hate that movie. But it's a similar situation where my very first public debate was actually with my former professor. My very first debate, one-on-one on God's existence, was with that professor. And if you get the whole package, you can take the download card for free. We also have download cards if you don't want to do a hard copy. And I want to be transparent, Pastor. Full disclosure, all proceeds, if you buy anything today, will go to feed a hungry family. Yeah, my hungry family. I have 2 kids, and they eat a lot, and they're outgrowing their clothes very fast. And if you're watching on the other campuses, if you want to go online to the church's website, you can make a donation, and in the message comment section, you can just say that you want a package. Let me know if you want a hard copy or the download cards, and I can leave those here. Well, let's go through these briefly. I was once talking with a young lady, and she said, Eric, you cannot claim that Christianity is true because there is no truth. And I said, really? Well, I just have one question. I said, is that true? Because you're telling me that there is no truth, but then you told me that as if what you just said was true. But if there is no truth, and by your own standards, what you just said cannot be true, it's what you call in philosophy self-defeating. I was invited once on this secular left-leaning radio show. They were not Christian, and they said, we like to invite people from the community to come on and talk about why they believe what they do. Would you be willing to come on and talk about why you're a Christian and take questions? I said, sure. So I'm only about 10 minutes into my presentation, and at the first commercial break, he says, I know you have a lot more to go through, but all the phone lines are ringing. Would you like to take a question? I said, yeah, that's fine. One guy calls in and he says, who are you to tell people they're wrong? I said, excuse me. He said, who are you to tell people they're wrong? See, you said you believed in God, and that's fine. Everyone believes in something, but then you said Christianity was true. Are you trying to tell me and everyone else listening that if you're not a Christian, you're wrong? And I said, yeah, that's how it works. If it's not true, it's false. He said, but you can't do that. Who are you to tell people that they're wrong? And I said, well, sir, calm down for a second. Let me see if I understand you correctly. Are you trying to tell me that it is inappropriate or immoral to tell people they're wrong? And he said, yes, you cannot tell people they're wrong. And I said, okay. Well, I just have one question. I said, if it's wrong to tell people they're wrong, then why are you calling me on a live public radio to tell me that I'm wrong if it's wrong to tell people that they're wrong? Scientism. Science is the only way to get knowledge about reality. There's lots to say. For the sake of time, suffice to say that this is false. If you want the big word, it's a view of epistemology, which is actually also self-defeating, but a few things. First, it's self-defeating. Why? Because to say that science is the only way to gain knowledge about reality is not a scientific statement, but a philosophical statement about science. So if you can only believe what science tells you, and that very statement is something philosophy tells you, then by your own standards, you cannot believe that science is the only thing you can believe. Because now you're doing philosophy, not science, and it's self-defeating. Or consider this. I've had atheists say, Eric, give me scientific evidence for God. And my response is usually, and why would I want to do a silly thing like that? And because there's a look of confusion, I say, let me explain it this way. God, if he exists, is a non-physical, by definition, a non-physical entity, and science is a wonderful tool, but it is a tool that is limited to only studying the physical world. So you cannot use something like science, which is limited to the physical, to try and investigate something non-physical. It is a category fallacy. It's like you going to the beach with your friend, and he comes back an hour later and says, I just discovered there is no plastic on this beach. And you look over his shoulder, and you see the beach is littered with plastic, and you say, why would you say that? Of course there is. And he says, well, because, look, I just took my metal detector, and I went for 1 hour scanning for anything I can find. And I found a lot of metal, but I found no plastic, therefore plastic must not exist. And you say, well, of course you didn't find plastic because it's a metal detector, not a plastic detector. You are using the wrong tool for the assessment. In the same way, I'm not showing that there is no evidence or conceding this point. I'm saying the very tool you're trying to use is a wrong tool, so your very assumption behind your worldview fails as a false presupposition, but we can talk about what is relevant to the discussion. It's a stronghold. What about naturalism? With the time we have left, before I go into, if we have time to talk about the soul, I do want to mention this briefly. Whether we realize it or not, these strongholds have crept into the church, and we haven't even noticed them. I don't have time to go through each one, but this one for sure, I do want to have some audience participation, if you don't mind. Do me a favor. Point to me, if you can point to what part of your body thinks. Can you do that for me? Okay, I see this. Okay, so brain, is that what we're saying? Does your brain think? Yeah. Do you need a brain to think? Yeah. Okay. Next question, does God have a brain? I didn't hear anything that time, I'm sorry. I know this isn't a Mormon church. No, God doesn't have a brain. But does God think? Yeah. Psalm says his thoughts about us are more than the grains of sand. He thinks. Huh. Hey, are you made in his image? Yeah. Well, hold on. You need a brain to think. God doesn't have a brain. Hey, do you need a brain to think? Why is this a conundrum? Why does this bring about this existential angst? In a nutshell, can I say it this way? Because we live in a culture that appears to be neutral And the culture says essentially, well, look, when there are thoughts, there's neurological activity. So let's just be neutral and say the brain thinks. That's not neutralism. That's naturalism. But we live in a culture that says your brain thinks. So we disagree, and we'll say, well, we'll talk about the soul and spirit in Sunday school. So we believe that the brain thinks, and then we come Sunday morning, we lift our hands, and we worship a God who has no brain and thinks just fine, but we don't let these two beliefs come together because we don't take our theology that seriously, nor do we think about it holistically, and there are strongholds even within our own mentality or doctrines because we failed in some instances to be the salt of the earth. If you don't like me, you don't have to invite me back. I'm done after this. So let's go through this. First, I want to point out this. If you don't know who this is, you need to. William Lane Craig has an argument that will not only show that naturalism is false, but show it's an argument for God's existence. It's called the Kalam Cosmological argument. Don't worry about the big fancy words, but it's only 3 sentences that can be memorized and presented in 30 seconds or less. So if you're in a taxi cab, an elevator, or if you follow someone to the bathroom and they sit down, you've got at least 30 seconds and you can get your witness in. And I'll take a little more than 30 seconds, but here's the argument. Premise 1, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, I've shared this in less than a minute with someone while I was getting my oil changed, and it breaks down like this. You can put it this way. When the universe began to exist, 3 things came into existence that did not exist without the universe, namely time, space, and matter. In other words, we could say if there were no universe, there would be no time, no space, and no matter. Are you with me so far? 2 people. So, if we go back here, we can look at the argument and say if everything begins and the universe began, then it needs a cause. We can actually unpack attributes of this cause by looking at its effects. In other words, in philosophy, causes will always precede their effects, be greater than their effects, and be external to their effects. For example, the person who made my computer is not inside of it making it run. As the cause of the existence of my computer, he is beyond, external to, and greater than my computer. So with this in mind, if time, space, and matter had a beginning, and there was a cause of time, space, and matter, then based on a logical deduction, it must follow that therefore the cause of time, space, and matter must be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Does that sound familiar to you? In other words, we can say if the universe began to exist, then there must exist, at the very least, an entity that is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Now, I've had an atheist stop me here and say, wait a minute, you're trying to talk about God. And I say, really, you think so? And he says, but why are you talking about God as a cause? Why couldn't something natural have caused the universe? Well, simply put, because nature had a beginning. And if all of nature had a beginning, then if you're going to tell me that something natural caused all of nature, you're essentially going to be saying that something natural existed prior to the natural in order to cause the natural to come into existence, which is a logical contradiction. So if nature had a beginning, you would need something beyond nature, something beyond the natural, something like there's a word for that. It's actually supernatural, literally beyond the natural. And you would need a being that is unimaginably powerful to create something out of nothing. I heard a joke once. A scientist said, God, I don't need you to create life. And God said, really? He said, oh, yeah. And God said, well, show me. So the scientist gets on his knees, and he starts to gather some dirt. And God says, whoa, time out, get your own dirt. Creation ex nihilo. And you would need a personal being. Why? Briefly, because the universe did not have to exist. It was caused to exist, and we know that that's a decision. Decisions come from minds, and minds we know are grounded in persons. So, for dramatic effect, you could take a deep breath and say, if the universe began to exist, then there must exist a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, supernatural, unimaginably powerful, personal being, and I just call him God for short. And I have the privilege of calling him my Heavenly Father. You are the salt of the earth. What about the soul? With the few minutes I have left, in a nutshell, here it is. First of all, if what my professor was saying is true, then whatever is true of the mind must be true of the brain. In philosophy, this is known as the law of identity. We'll put it this way. Suppose you walk into a lab, you see 2 bottles of clear fluid. Based on this law and philosophy, if they're the same substance, whatever is true of one is true of the other. But let's say one is water and the other one is chemical X, but the label's ripped off. So we think, well, they're both fluids, they're both clear, they must be the same substance, until you turn over chemical X and it says caution flammable, and you think, well, I know that water's not flammable, which means even if I don't know what chemical X is, at the very least, I know that they cannot be the same thing. Are you with me? Now, with this in mind, if what my professor is saying is true, then whatever is true of the mind must be true of the brain. But if I can show something true of the brain that's not true of the mind, well, they can't be the same thing. In other words, if atheism is true, I asked an atheist this, would you agree that if atheism is true, non-physical things should not exist? He said yes. I said, okay. But that also means if something non-physical did exist, well, then atheism would be false. So we could put it this way. If atheism is true, consciousness must be physical. But if consciousness is not physical, well, then, again, atheism cannot be true. So the question is consciousness physical? And the answer is no. Here's why, briefly. Take the mind and brain. Are they the same thing? No, your thoughts are not in your brain, they're in your mind, but your mind uses your brain like a guitarist would use a guitar. The notes of the guitar are not in the guitar. You don't break at the guitar and the notes fall out. Same thing with the mind and brain. But let's hear how they're different. My thoughts can be true or false, but my brain isn't true or false. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you right now does not weigh 3 pounds. You may be having heavy thoughts this morning, but you're not going to buy a neck brace when we leave the church. My brain can be 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana is not 7 inches long. And there's a lot more I can go through, but the point is simple. If all the properties of the brain are physical and all the properties of the mind are non-physical, then consciousness, if it exists, cannot be physical. So, Mr. Atheist, if consciousness exists and can't be physical, and if you have consciously decided to become an atheist, then you shouldn't be an atheist because atheism can't be true. As mentioned, you can go here if you want to pull out your phone, take a picture. You can go here to download the notes. You can go to my YouTube channel. If you have a phone, you can also scan this for that. I end by saying you are the salt of the earth, but if it loses its purpose, it will be walked on. But we have the truth, we have the gospel, we have the evidence on our side. Go and be the salt of the earth, and let's win this culture for his kingdom. Amen.